Mathieu, je suis directeur exécutif de l'Institut montréalais d'études sur le génocide et les droits de la personne à l'Université Concordia. Bienvenue aux deuxième journée du forum sur l'intelligence artificielle et droits de la personne. Nous remercions l'appui du gouvernement du Canada, le gouvernement du Québec, la commission de l'UNESCO, canadienne à l'UNESCO et l'ambassade des Pays-Bas au Canada. Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm executive director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're pleased to welcome you to day 2 of the Human Rights and AI Forum. We want to thank our partners, Global Affairs Canada, the Quebec government, the Ministère des Relations Internationales et Francophonie, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and the Embassy of the Netherlands to Canada. And we're really excited to have an amazing panel today to talk about misinformation and AI, friends or foes. And I would like to pass over to the moderator, Fenwick McKelvey, who's a professor at Concordia University. Fenwick, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And just before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on the unceded indigenous lands of the Kanakahage Nation, and they're the custodians of the lands and water in which we gather today. And Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. And today it's home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. And we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And I think one thing that I'm so thankful for is that actually being at Concordia and seeing the leadership of Jason Lewis at the Indigenous Futures Group. And I think it's one thing that I'm so thankful to have their team there. And if people are interested, I really encourage you to check it out, because I think it's at the forefront of AI research happening right now globally. And so I think it's one of the many things to be thankful today about being located in Tiohtià:ke. So today I just want to say that this is a really fantastic panel with some of my favorite people. And so we have 3 panelists, and Camille is joining us as well. Our first panelist is the prestigious Concordia alumni, Joan Donovan, Research Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy, where she leads the Technology and Social Change Project. And I would really encourage folks to check it out. The Media Manipulation Casebook, I think, is a really fantastic study of how you do research on social media, misinformation and disinformation. It's one of the things that I think is a really important contribution to the field. That's one of Joan's many accomplishments. Aside from being the co-creator of our national treasure, the beaver emoji, Joan has also, I think, built the foundations of the discussion about the use of AI in misinformation and disinformation studies with the report Cheap Fakes, co-written with Britt Paris. Second, we have Camille François, who is the Chief Information Officer at Graphika, where she leads the company's work to detect and mitigate disinformation, media manipulation, and harassment. Camille has an impressive background as a principal researcher at Jigsaw, served as a chief advisor to the Chief Technology Office of France in the Prime Minister's office, as well as being a Mozilla Fellow and a Berkman Klein Center affiliate. Finally, we have Taylor Owen, who is the Beaver Chair in Media Ethics and Communications, Associate Professor and Founding Director of the Media Center, the Director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy in the Max Bell School of Public Policy. I think Taylor is one of Canada's most prominent public intellectuals dealing with media and technology, and I think really has pushed our conversation to understand the consequences of technology and media change to ensuring and renewing the kind of institutions of democracy. And I think that his interventions in public commentary, I think, have been central in advancing the kind of field of the discussion. So it's wonderful that he joins us today. And Taylor also hosts the podcast Big Tech, which I encourage folks to check out. And so we decided that this is a conversation, this is a discussion. And what we wanted to do was start it off with a bit of questions to each of the panelists. And we wanted to begin with thinking about how AI fits into the misinformation and disinformation space. And I'm wondering if we might be able to kind of talk about what do we mean, what are the key terms when we describe the relationship between AI, misinformation, and disinformation. I mentioned, Joan, you start with your cheap fakes and deep fakes. I wonder if you wanted to start that discussion.
Oh my goodness. Well, really happy to be here. As I was telling Fen and Taylor, I'm a big fan of being an alumni of Concordia, and believed I got the best of my education out of the sociology program that I attended, where I was grilled in social theory by none other than Bart Simon, and sort of forever indebted to the Montreal way of thinking about problems, which is to say that you don't start to separate and remove technology from politic, from government, from journalism, right? One of the things that I learned in my early training as a sociologist was that it's all many parts of a whole. And when we start to think holistically about things like AI or technological innovation, the technologist would have you believe that technology is rather determined, that it's on its way, it's going to be in a trajectory, that innovation's going to happen, and that society must reckon with it in some kind of way. However, as a sociologist, you start to think, well, what are the political conditions under which this technology is made? Or if you take it from the point of view of the economy, what are the economic conditions under which this kind of technology is made? And time again, we're brought back to some really essential questions about, is this technology, the innovations behind it, the designers, what are their values? What is being put into the design? How is it coming together so as to be both overhyped and over promising its potential so that it can, drive more, drive a higher price tag? And, do those people even think about the public interest? And as I was watching yesterday, I think I saw Facebook's going to roll out a Clubhouse type app related to, audio chat rooms. And I just keep thinking about the way in which our current technology systems are being put together, kind of like a bricolage. And I'm starting to realize that the value set, the ultimate commitments, the who we want these products to serve is increasingly not present, right? So you have a very robust civil society that is saying, from the ACLU to Algorithmic Justice League, no, do not continue with facial recognition technology, for instance. And these companies are like, you know what I could do? I could build it better. I could build it more precise. So, anytime you approach these problems from the point of view of anywhere other than the technology should be designed, if you approach it as a sociologist, if you approach it as a politician, if you approach it as an advocate, you run into these very complicating questions. However, the technology keeps getting built, and it keeps getting built in bigger and bigger data sets with fewer and fewer mechanisms of oversight. And so the broad picture and the broad strokes of something like deepfakes then isn't just about, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could bring actors who have passed away or musicians who have passed away back to life and see what they would have made if they had been stuck in this really dumb movie or made to do a song and dance at Coachella or something. But you look downstream of that to the everyday impacts, and you look at research like Danielle Citron's, and you find that the people bearing the cost, the true costs of this kind of technology, are young women and girls who are being harassed. They're being blackmailed. Their likeness is being put into what would be the kindest way to say it is pornography, but really this is kind of sexual harassment. And, we have other research out there that says most deepfakes are for pornographic purposes, right? And it might be stealing the likeness of a celebrity. And, over here you have a bunch of academics saying, well, the biggest problem with deepfakes is they're going to say a lie that a politician said, and it's going to be really hard to figure out if that politician really said it or not. And I'm like, I don't really see that as the main problem. I'm much more in the Danielle Citron camp of we're going to have AI that is going to have these use cases that are deployed against people that have no capacity to speak back to power. They have no capacity to right these wrongs. Nevertheless, you have industry saying, well, we'll watermark it. We'll make it so that in the corner of the video it says, you know, this is not an authentic video. That's my technologist voice, by the way. And I'll wrap up around this point, which is just to say that there's nothing inevitable about any of the technology that we build, and there's nothing inevitable about these companies persisting either. There can be an internet without Facebook. There can be AI without facial recognition. But what we need to do as a society is decide where those lines are going to be. And we need to do it fast because ultimately this technology is being built. It is being deployed. And if we do not get a sense of what the harms are, and we allow an industry to grow around it before we have rules that says what those industries should and shouldn't be doing, then we're going to be in positions like we have been for the last couple of years, where politics as we know it, democracy as we know it, I should say, is not going to be possible. Our public health is going to suffer from millions of billions of people getting the wrong information at the right time. That is, they're going to be told misinformation when they're supposed to be making a decision about their health and their vitality. And we're going to be in a big mess. And I think we're already there, which is to say that I hope that academics and policymakers and technologists and researchers and journalists are up to the charge of trying to steer this ship. Thanks, Fen.
Thanks, Joan. That was great. I think really, points out, I think one of the kind of key things is about emphasizing some of the political economy that's driving this technology. And certainly the fact that so much of this is factored into kind of pornography and the exploitation of women online, I think speaks to the need to kind of pay attention to both, you know, what's funding this and also what are the blind spots. I mean, I always think back to Robert Gell's work describing that it's actually largely Playboy images that define the first, you know, AI being used to detect genitalia and stuff like that. And so it really, I think, you know, speaks both to, you know, what are the sets of issues we're facing, and also just who's being excluded, who is counted as like legitimate policymakers, and often what's going on in the debate over Pornhub in Canada right now, you know, who are the sex workers being excluded from these policy conversations. And I think that, you know, that I think speaks to also some of these deeper concerns of, rather than the abstract of online harm, how do we talk about kind of the specific consequences of misogyny and the digitization of misogyny that we're dealing with? And I think we will get back to that, because I think also some of your concerns are raising not only what are the kind of examples, but also the consequences of thinking that the way we can fix AI is with more AI. And the consequences of a regulatory tool. Camille, I was wondering that in your own work, I was wondering if you could also describe how you've encountered and had to deal with artificial intelligence in the misinformation and disinformation space.
Yeah, thank you. I was just, reflecting on everything Joan just said, and surprisingly, I really agree. And, my mind was going to a project I've been working on with the Algorithmic Justice League that thinks about what are the ways and the processes that we can put in place to surface, to expose, and to redress AI harms. Because the other thing that comes with it here is, more often than not, those AI harms are not properly exposed or not properly documented or not properly redressed, right? It is very much a haphazard way of, some of them blow up on social media, some of them are sort of painfully uncovered by researchers. But I think we really need a stronger set of processes around that. Now, taking a step back and refocusing on the disinformation conversation, AI is an interesting, topic here. I like the framing of the panel on, is it a friend or is it a foe? My mind immediately goes, of course, to the use of AI to create synthetic social media posts, right? So as we talked about, there was initially a lot of focus on deepfakes, what synthetic video can do to the world of disinformation. I think that the harms have been very thoroughly documented, as we said, and it's important to re-say it again. They tend to harm marginalized populations first, and they tend to, be used to generate porn, for instance. That's something that's been very clear in the use of deepfakes. But if you think about other types of technology, something that comes up all the time in disinformation campaign, for instance, is the use of generative adversarial networks to generate fake faces, right? Why would you want to do this? If you want to do an army of fake profiles, of course, it's quite convenient to have a face of someone that never existed, someone who's not a real person, because then it's harder for people to say, well, this account isn't who they say they are, rather they have stolen the image of X, right? I remember personally the first time that my team worked on a campaign that used a lot of GAN faces in a disinformation campaign. It was December 2019. It was an enormous operation. We partnered with the DFR lab to write a large report describing all these fake profiles having fake faces using AI, and we called it FFS, which I think we decided really meant fake faces swarm or something like that. And I remember back then thinking, oh, that's unusual. We kind of always knew this was coming, that, these kind of GAN faces, of course, would be used in disinformation campaign. But what happened afterwards was remarkable, because very quickly, that tactic really spread to all types of actors and all types of campaign, and really became routine. And so every time we would uncover a new operation, more often than not, they would actually use GAN faces to create those fake accounts. If I think back in the US 2020 presidential election, we had worked on a series of small foreign influence campaigns targeting the election. And here, in campaigns originating from Russia and Iran and China, we have seen the use of GAN faces across all these different operations. So that, for me, comes to mind as a technology which really, unfortunately, has found its place in the toolkit that disinformation actors use on a regular basis. It's not perfect, as in it's still possible for investigator to really look at these pictures and see the ways in which they're still struggling to mimic normal faces, and to say, the symmetry isn't right or the background is blurred. But at the end of the day, really, we do not have publicly available, reliable tools that allow researchers, journalists, and external parties to do detection of these large faces at scale. It remains very much a manual process. So that's what's immediately coming to mind. The other thing, of course, is the threat of potential synthetic text, right? The use of large models, right, like GPT-3, GPT-2, to generate large batches of text. Now, this is problematic for two reasons. The first one is the harms and biases that come with those large language models are now well documented. And as a result, relying on them creates often really problematic batches of text. And the other reason is it's very convenient, if you're running an information operation, a large-scale disinformation campaign, to have access to tools that can generate a lot of believable, credible text. And so I think back, for instance, on working with people who are former, for instance, troll farm employees who told stories of having to do a fake blog, for instance, about gardening, so that once in a while you would insert and really inject a political post. Now you can essentially automate the production of this text. I had this bizarre moment in my life where I played with one of these classifiers to write a text about the threat of these classifiers, and it came up with a metaphor that I will, as a result, credit them for. It was the classifier's metaphor, not mine. It was GPT-2, and it said it's going to end up being the gray goo of the internet, the thing that can spread anywhere and really sort of, do a toxic spill everywhere. I call that the threat of read fakes, right? So it's the deep fakes of reading, and that is something that's often top of mind.
Thanks, Camille. That's really helpful too, because you can think that when we're talking about AI in this space, we're talking about not only fake or deep fake videos that Joan mentioned, but also synthetic text and synthetic faces. And I think that all this, pointing to what you're pointing to, is that it's lowering the cost of generating and faking public opinion. And I think that's a long history of AstroTurf and the consequences and the cost of that. And here you basically can automate and do this at scale. And I think one of the risks that you also come up is then it becomes harder and harder to gauge public opinion or understanding what other peers think about things, because it's hard to know whether that's real or not. So whether it's effective or not, it erodes and declines in trust. And I think that certainly is a big issue now, because we're dealing with a vaccine environment and we're trying to think about a post-COVID landscape, and how do we understand the kind of consequences to misinformation and disinformation in this kind of changed landscape. And I was wondering, Taylor, I know that your research has been kind of following and tracking, been active throughout the pandemic. I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to the kind of changing context of the pandemic in this field.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to get into that, but just a couple things broadly on that first question, I think, on AI and misinformation, because it's one that I really struggle with. And in part because I feel, certainly in a policy frame and even in an analytic one, AI has become an incredibly slippery concept. And it's just come to mean so many different things. It gets broadly used as a metaphor for automation and for the scale of certain companies in our ecosystem. It gets broadly used as a kind of industrial cover for actual physical labor practices. And Kate Crawford, in her new book, amazing new book, has this wonderful concept of Potemkin AI, of AI just being sort of a fake layer sitting on top of physical labor. But it's also being used broadly as sort of a driver of certain monopolistic practices, and real gatekeepers emerging about who can access the training data needed to actually participate in the development of AI tools and the economy being built on that. So it's become all these different things. And when you look at the misinformation problem in particular, sort of focus in from all those much broader set of challenges and structural challenges, really, as Joan laid out. Even within the media ecosystem or the platform ecosystem, AI is used for such a diverse range of purposes, often cross purposes, or to counter out the effects of each other, that it's really difficult to get your head around. I mean, one way to sort of think that through, I think, is AI in many ways drives and shapes aspects of the ecosystem itself, whether through recommendation engines or search or feed filtering or amplification algorithms or ad targeting systems or increasingly facial recognition layers inside the tech infrastructure. All of those things are AI is at least playing a role in determining the character of that public sphere in which misinformation is a challenge. But then on the flip side, in the ecosystem, AI is also being used to counter some of those harms. And even that is a slippery space where it's not always easy to see where AI is working, where people are working, when in the process of takedowns or content moderation, AI is playing a role or not. We know it's happening in the ex-ante case for sure, around screening of child exploitation, sexual exploitation, around copyright filtering, obviously, like that's sort of this before it happens AI role. But we also know that AI is playing this much bigger role in all the ex-post cases of content moderation, whether it be proactive around terrorist content or violent extremism increasingly, but also in this much more sort of opaque world of reactive content moderation, where we know there's a symbiotic relationship between human labor and the way AI functions. And so I don't know if it's not a clear in any way framework for this, but when we're thinking about AI and misinformation, I think there's a real tendency to sort of slide down this path of just thinking of AI as this all-powerful, amorphous, unknowable thing. which in some ways plays into the dominance of those that have access to the technology, when really we need to sort of break down the work it's actually doing. And then we can start talking about, okay, is it causing harm, or are there potential benefits of it, and which should be disincentivized or potentially incentivized through some sort of policy framework, which I know we'll get to.
I think that's a great framing, Taylor, to first emphasize just the fact that artificial intelligence has been used to regulate content at scale and is now integral to our media environment. And so, even getting beyond the kind of content question, there is, I think, this kind of key question about how it has, at least its kind of jurisdiction is kind of, system building, and that I think, points to one aspect of it. And then, specifically, it gets into the fact that it's often used as a regulatory tool, which is I want to get to, but I just heard a lot, and maybe you could bounce off of it, is this question of those who have access to the technology. And what I'm really interested in is where we talk about expertise and who has this problem, like who is able to both identify the problem and talk about solutions and remedies to it. And I'm just wondering, in your own situation, how is the turn to artificial intelligence as a solution and also as a way of identifying the problem? Does that create problems for you as a researcher to talk about the space, if especially it becomes something where it's just a matter of a new cybersecurity threat and spam filtering? How do you think about trying to carve out that expertise in the face of the fact that it could be just something that AI is better at doing?
Got it. I mean, I'd love to hear from Joan and Camille on this, because they're much more the closer to this than I am. But I mean, I do think that, like often happens when a complex emerges, an industrial complex or a conceptual complex, the opacity of the concept or the framework can detract from understanding the components of it. And I feel that's partly what's happened in the AI space, that we've had this just huge push towards AI governance in the international sort of arena, which we'll talk about, but also in the research world, that a huge amount of work has sort of focused and zeroed in on AI as the thing that we need to pay attention to and understand. And I think in many cases of both, we actually already had the frameworks for understanding some of those problems, whether it be social economic frameworks for understanding access and inequities built into the system, whether it be frameworks of data privacy and sharing and abuses, whether it be the economic systems that drive the industrial uses of these various technologies and which actors emerge. Those things don't need us to zero in on AI as the concept to understand them, because they exist embedded in this infrastructure already. And in some ways, I worry that focusing on this very sort of intangible thing of AI in the way it's framed, I mean, we can zero in on what it actually is, but I think what it actually is often very distant from how it gets framed in our public discourse. So that opacity ends up detracting and obfuscating in many cases from the actual things we could do to deal with some of these structural problems that apply both to the uses of AI, but also to the broader ecosystem and many of these challenges like mis and disinformation that we're talking about.
And Taylor, that's also just a great point. Yeah, is that the thing we're worried about artificial intelligence? Are we looking at the kind of growing prominence of hate and far-right extremism? What are the kind of ways we're shifting to the policy conversation? And is AI ultimately the right frame, or maybe it's something secondary? Yeah. Camille, I think your comments also had me kind of think about this question too, is that AI seems to be infecting your work too, about being a researcher in this space. And that it seems like these questions of access to data and access to platforms to do research is one that we always hear. But I'm just wondering if you could talk specifically about whether AI has changed that, or is that created more complications to what it already is a pretty fraught relationship with the platforms and the companies you're intending to research?
Yeah, and let me just start by saying I really appreciate Taylor's comments and reframing here. I think that we project so much onto AI, and more often than not, we end up in conversations about something else. It's true on the regulation side, right? Like people say, well, we have an AI problem. And I find myself really, again, resonating with what Taylor just said and thinking like, do you have an antitrust problem and then a privacy problem and then a consumer protection problem?
Totally.
And it's always super important to sort of like trying to go back to, not what is the vector by which your problem arrived, but really what is it that you're trying to solve. On the sort of day-to-day of a disinformation researcher, it's the same thing. A lot of the tools that we use on a day-to-day are also not AI, right? Some of them are. There are machine learning classifiers that have been built on a few specific criteria, but a lot of the tools that are routinely used are also simple automation, right? And other types of, data analysis techniques that are needed for sure when you want to study large-scale conversations. And so I think it's okay to say, we do need a series of tools. We do need a series of, data analysis techniques. We do need at times automation in order to do this analysis of large-scale conversations because of the volume, and then to be more precise on in which ways specific techniques of machine learning can help and in which ways can they not help. And so I'll tell you about something that I see, for instance, on a routine basis, which is people wanting to detect Russian troll campaign by training classifier on the content of other Russian information operations. Now, I sort of understand how you get to that idea, but more often than not, I see people go through the pitfall of using content that is designed to mimic, right, organic political conversation. And if you do train classifiers on this type of content, of course, what you end up doing is training a classifier to detect online political conversation. And even to the extent that there might be, for instance, specific mistakes that are interesting in the context of information operation, that doesn't mean that they're a strong feature to train a classifier on. So let me give, again, a specific example. It is true that at times, sophisticated actors, particularly foreign sophisticated actors who are trying to mimic political conversations, will say things that are grammatically incorrect or idiomatic. But that in itself doesn't mean that anybody who says something idiomatic on the internet is a foreign actor, right? If you solely sort of point these tools, these classifiers, and these AI techniques at the objects that you think are suspicious without taking into account the great diversity of online conversation, the great diversity of the political conversation and civic movements that we want to protect on the internet, you're also likely to do more harm than good. For instance, by singling out every people whose English isn't their first language and who will say unidiomatic things about politics here and there. So I really resonate with making sure that we don't put everything in the AI bag. And then when we do talk about AI, when we do talk about specific machine learning classifiers, we can have a sophisticated conversations around what are the harms of applying them the wrong way on specific subsets of the disinformation research. That being said, we will need AI and good machine learning classifiers to detect things like GAN faces, for instance. That is likely to be an AI tool that should be built and that will be helpful for researchers in that space.
Camille, I think that's a really great point, and one I think that shouldn't be abstract in Canada. I think there was, in my own research, trying to deal with bots or alleged bots in the Canadian Ontario election when Doug Ford got elected like generations ago, it feels like. But I think a big question was that a lot of the things that were being flagged as bots could have been ESL speakers. And I think that really caused me to take a pause on this idea that it's some easy way of detecting bots. And seemingly, that really hasn't stopped the field from trying to make claims about that it can detect bots based on classifying certain types of speech. And this, I think, raises an issue which we've seen throughout the panel, which is that potentially the turn towards AI as a regulatory tool is going to create new exclusions and I think new new forms of marginalization, data marginalizations. And you can look at Ruha Benjamin's work on the new Jim Code, just to think about the way that this often might target Black bodies, and also I think in Canada, Indigenous bodies who might not fit the kind of definitions or the working definitions of what is a trusted actor in politics. Joan, I wanted you to kind of close, or this section out a little bit, talking a bit about, I think, another issue here, which is what's driving AI in many ways, is that the political economy, and that many of these companies who are collecting greater and greater amounts of data for targeted advertising also have realized that it's useful for training AI. And so how do we think about the relationship between AI and data monopolies in our day and age?
Yeah, softball question, about to hit it out of the park by saying, I'm going to do the old journalist trick, which is, answer the question you wish you had been asked. I'm just kidding, Fen. Taylor gets it in the sense that AI isn't the thing we're fighting about. Camille, always a pleasure to be on panels with Camille, because she also gets the technical piece of the puzzle alongside the social, which is that more data means different kinds of tools, means different kinds of products, means different kinds of entrepreneurs, means different kinds of scams, grifts, hoaxes, etc. All the while, there's something going on with technology itself, which is to say that there's a new book Michael Siliano has written about creative control. And the idea behind his research is something that I've, kind of embodied over the course of my lifetime, which is technology is cool. And because it's cool, it becomes really hard for us to realize what it's doing and how it's impacting us. Because we're like, oh, look at that guitar. That guitar is cool. Oh, look at those keyboards. Those keyboards are cool. Look at those LPs. Those speakers are cool. Those CDs are cool. Everything feels cool. And then as a result, we don't actually see a lot of the other stuff around it, the labor, the ownership, the trails, the digital trails that we leave behind that many of us probably wish didn't exist anymore. I've kind of grew up, sort of the best parts of my youth, thankfully, were not recorded on video. But, I'm now in the mix of an entire generation of people who have to be mindful that everything they say or do is going to be recorded and then somehow come back later, like a Stephen King novel. Which is to say that there is money in databases. There is money in these data trails. There is money in collecting everything until such time that you can figure out how to sell it to someone else. Meanwhile, we've really lost the thread on what's happening, because every new piece of this technology seems so either cool and impressive or devastating to democracy and in all that it implies. I'm not in the camp of science and technology scholars that'll just give up and say, technology should be able to do what it's going to do and that society just must reckon with it. But I'm also not all the way over on the other side of saying that policy is going to be able to fix all these problems, which is to say that we do need to come together across professions and start to think about what regulation is necessary and what kind of oversight is necessary so that we don't get runaway technologies that are, essentially experiments, right? I can train this classifier to make it look for, the example that I go to is hate speech. Everybody's like, well, I get a dictionary of hate speech, and then I can train my classifier and I can, use it to moderate content. And ergo, Facebook makes these claims all the time that they take down 95% of hate speech. And I'm like, still a lot up there. So if you got 95 or 98% of it, that just means you're capturing stuff that are known knowns. And so, for me, as I start to think through this, I also am a historian of technology, many of my side jobs. And in my side hustle, in 2013, 2014, we really cared about big data. And then we really cared about algorithms. And now we really care about AI. And in the middle somewhere, we cared about machine learning. And for me, though, they're all interrelated and interconnected sets of problems that arise from a kind of entrepreneurship that doesn't take at its core community safety. Above personal or individual safety, or even the watchword of privacy, we need to introduce a concept like community safety to not just design, but also to our regulatory process, so that we can evaluate and say, yeah, there is something about this that is detrimental to community safety, and therefore there need to be different kinds of oversight and different kinds of guardrails and protections built in. And I'll give one example from the pandemic that I think drives the point home, which is way back in April of last year, which feels like a lifetime ago. I wrote a little piece for MIT Tech Review that said, you know what we could do with all this advertising infrastructure is we could help people understand timely, local, relevant, and accurate information, and use the advertising infrastructure to get in needed information about the pandemic to people very quickly. And it's a kind of repurposing of something that is already built. But by and large, the solution was so weak that ended up occurring, which was basically that you see these yellow Band-Aids on every website that's just like, remember to know that coronavirus exists. There's nothing that was helpful to people. And now that we don't have that infrastructure in the United States where people are able to know where and how to get vaccines, we see all kinds of grifts and scams and hoaxes and medical misinformation basically pop up at the seams of these platforms, because they're only looking for certain kinds of things, or they're not looking at all because looking makes them culpable for these kinds of threats. And you know, it's almost like living in the twilight zone as a researcher or a journalist at this stage, because you keep making recommendations that are about just trying to fix the little bits you can that are just obvious things that would help. And it gets shot down for, you know, oh no, we're going to take this other approach. Meanwhile, people are dying. And in the US anyway, I don't know what the situation's like in Canada. I got to check in with my in-laws, but you know, we're living in a moment where Americans are hyper polarized on masks, which is the easiest thing one person could do to protect themselves and others from passing this virus on to one another. And to be hyper polarized on masks isn't just a question of like, well, how did people get information or how did they get misinformation? But it points to just the brokenness of our media ecosystem, where so many people were served so much misinformation that many don't even know what or who to believe anymore. And ultimately, like, as we start to think about the technology question, I'll return to my first point, which is always my last point, which is that we need a whole of society approach to this. We cannot say, oh, it's the tech sector's job to fix what they broke. Certainly it's the tech sector's job to share some of those profits so that others can fix what they broke, including especially journalism. But in the long run, we're in an adjustment phase, a kind of glitch related to a new technology that has been rolled out without any foresight as to what could go wrong if millions of people get served, you know, militarized conspiracy theories, or medical misinformation reaches millions. And so I'm hoping that across borders and across nations and across this globe, that we start to care more about the infrastructure of the internet itself and less about platforms, and start to imagine a future without Facebook.
I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole talking about internet infrastructure, but Joan, I'm there for you.
That was bait. That was bait, Fenwick.
Yeah, no, I'm a moderator. But I mean,
if ever there was Fen bait, it is that.
I know one button he has, and I'm pushing it.
Well, I think that it's interesting to me also. What's going on here is a kind of framing question. I mean, I think we're all talking around. One of the things that's coming up is that AI isn't the problem. And so what are the deeper structural issues that are coming up? I mean, I think that there's the emphasis of that in Canada. I think there's also talking about settler colonialism, misogyny, those are the things that, are driving and enabled and can take advantage of it. But that's a different framing than worrying about this thing called AI as Taylor makes out whatever it is. I think to me, one thing that's happening is just greater emphasis in trying to secure and frame what's happening in the internet infrastructure as a security issue, as a cybersecurity issue. And I think that, that's some of my questioning is trying to emphasize that, what the expertise of this panel has is thinking about these issues differently than something about, well, there's harmful content. We're going to use an automated filter to remove that content from the internet, as though that is actually a functional policy. And that I think specifically has issues in Canada right now, because we are talking about all sorts of kind of blocking mechanisms at the internet infrastructure level. And I think that those are ones that are only policy conversations that are really seen as a technical question or a security question. And I think that, again, that really points out to Joan's point where it's like it's a fancy technology issue, and that all of a sudden negates or allows us to avoid all those kind of deeper, harder questions. But Taylor, I wanted to, this was a kind of a transition, but AI isn't something that is AI has a whole host of ambiguous things, but if it's created a problem, it's certainly being used, I think, more than anything as the fix. We hear that all the time. What we're going to do is an AI is going to fix this. That's how most platforms rely on addressing these contents, as Joan mentioned. I'm just wondering, how do you see this rising issue of AI as being the de facto solution to this problem?
In the regulatory frame, there's a couple of ways into that. I mean, one is, as you say, AI already does a ton of regulatory work. It just does so within the context of private spaces. AI uses content moderation, AI uses filtering, whatever it might be. That is a form of regulating speech that just happens to sit outside of the public governance. It happens in private spaces. But AI is also a subject of regulatory action increasingly. And here I think that distinction between what are the aspects of AI that might need to be regulated because either the market isn't regulating them, well, both the market isn't regulating them and there may be some perceived social or economic harm, so they should be subject to some sort of regulatory framework. And there are certainly some aspects of AI that might benefit, as we're starting to see in certain jurisdictions, from some forms of regulatory restriction. I mean, we're seeing that in the EU with this, as you were talking about this morning, Ben, around this shift to sort of a rights-based approach, a risk-based approach, within the EU framework, and even a banning on certain use cases of AI, probably to be brought in the EU. But even things like bot identification or transparency reporting or impact assessments or audits or all these ways we're starting to talk and think about regulating certain attributes of what we're framing under AI. But we do have to keep asking, to what degree are those conversations distracting from some of the, in some ways, as Joan said, easier things that we just haven't done, like modernizing privacy laws, data privacy laws, like regulating the ad space, like better competition policy. Like there's some real low-hanging fruit there that sometimes this framing around AI, I think, risks detracting from. But the one other flip side around this regulatory space I think is really important is that the response to regulations from platforms also leverages AI. And I think that needs to be better integrated into our policy conversation. And a great example of this is the sort of platform response to NetzDG. And that the policy framework didn't properly take into account the reality that the companies themselves were going to automate their regulatory response, and that could have different downstream effects. So again, I just sort of urge a slightly broader conversation in the regulatory space and the policy space about first what we're actually getting at, and do the harms sit in those attributes of AI that we're focusing on from a regulatory standpoint? And then second, what are going to be the downstream effects of those regulatory moves? So yeah, but that conversation is emerging, and that's, I think, generally a positive thing.
I think, Taylor, that's a fantastic point. I think that you can, next is use one example. I think also just deepfakes itself. The way Facebook addressed the deepfakes issue was to create a challenge on Kaggle for people to train the best identifier for deepfaked images. And I think that is such a bizarro world, but that's effectively, and I think we agree here, that's the policymaking process that we're trying to at least publicize. Yeah. And it's one that I think is often not happening or being shuffled off from the center stage. I mean, Camille, I just want to know, we have a few minutes left, but I'm also just wondering yourselves, like how are you encountering this, shift in this move to AI as a solution? And how do you see that in your work, given your kind of more holistic approach to dealing with the kind of consequences of misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah, I was, thinking about Taylor's remark on AI being both the focus of the regulations and many times the means by which some of the regulatory principles are going to be carried. And I'm thinking the next step is to have GPT-3 write a regulation about AI so that we have an AI regulation written by an AI and we can assess how far we are really from self-awareness.
Full circle.
Full circle. Jokes aside, I actually started my career in Silicon Valley, working for Google. And I think that, I was very much back then in an environment in which AI is the problem to many harms. And so for me, if anything, I kind of see the opposite, movement from my own lens, which is I see how much the debate is also being reframed today. I think one of these important reframing is even this idea of AI harms, right? We used to talk about AI fairness, AI biases, and all of this, I think, takes it away from the harm on society and the harm on individuals. And I'm personally quite encouraged by seeing this framing of AI harms being adopted. I'm encouraged with research being celebrated around the ways in which AI actually does, harm specific individuals and communities. I think that, for instance, what the FTC said yesterday is also encouraging and going in the right direction. So I think it's a slow path, but, again, I tend to be an optimistic, but I think looking closely, I feel like the reframing as AI not being the solution to everything and also carrying with it real potential for harms, both at the individual and the society level, is something that it's making its way. Now, how long do we need to wait for it to make its way into smart regulations? I don't know. That's always the question, but I'm also quite interested in seeing what Joan has to say on how much we're breaking away from a frame of AI having to be the answer to every harm, including AI itself.
Thanks, Camille. And Joan, I guess I'll pass it to you. I think you already kind of set it up to give you some more bait. You talked about regulation not being the answer and AI not being the answer. I mean, you can look at, say, labor activism at Google and the work of Meredith Whittaker and trying to advance real reforms. I'm just wondering, where else do you look for? What do you want as a takeaway in terms of where advocacy and where change should be happening?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I strive for as an academic is to retain my independence. And it gets harder and harder to do every day, as well, journalism, because of the nature and the structure of the technology that we are supposed to be generating knowledge about, right? Journalists generate knowledge, academics generate knowledge. And what the stakes of that is essentially that now you have a bunch of journalists who are about to be confronted with writing about technology policy that is going to affect their industry more than anybody else. But what we don't have is a clear commitment from these platform companies that are causing huge amounts of a harm, not in a nebulous sense, but actual and demonstrated wires to the weeds, direct connections between planning an insurgency and it happening at the US Capitol. Where Facebook could have intervened at any point and removed many more of the connective infrastructure that built Stop the Steal. That'll come out in time, I'm sure. But what's apparent to every journalist and researcher that was watching that be planned is that not enough was being done. And so access is paramount in terms of trying to figure out, how does oversight happen, and these companies now have generated such a toxic culture for their employees that daily people from these companies are leaking information to the press. It is the last place you want to be as a company, where your employees now see it as their moral duty to stay on board in order to subvert your business. And so that's the situation that we're in. AI, of course, is an important subset of this problem, not just because of the promise it holds for solving really difficult problems, like, potentially we could have AI that eventually helps us cure cancer. I mean, there are some real benefits to technology, but when it's technology applied to the social, right? It's technology applied to society, and it has no parameters that enforce some goodwill. What we end up with is media manipulators, disinformers figuring out how to use that same technology to subvert democracy and public health. And so what I'm really hoping for in the next decade is a much more collaborative space in which these technology companies decide, this is what my product does, and I'm going to make it the best product on the face of the earth to serve that very narrow purpose. But for as long as these technology companies are everything to everyone, the openness and the scale with which they allow messages to reach the public will always run to the advantage of liars, authoritarians, fascists, and those that seek to do much more destructive technology than, or much more destruction to society than our technologists could have ever imagined as they were at their whiteboard deciding how things should be patched together. Another thing we could also look to that I think is really important is, good old-fashioned education, right? There's no way that we learn about this stuff without teaching about this stuff. And so we are going to have to put in place a more robust public-facing education programs for our journalists, for our advocates, for our public health officials, for our election officials, so that we can deal with this as it progresses. And for me, it's always been the question of the right metaphor. And so right now, I think as I think about the problem of at least misinformation and what it poses, it's not the question of somebody's wrong on the internet. It's really about, how does misinformation reach millions of people? And right now, the conduit for that, of course, is the platforms. And so I talk about misinformation at scale as being a problem of secondhand smoke, which is to say that you don't get secondhand smoke as a concept without a whole field of people coming together to try to reckon with it, and then realizing that there need to be rules put in place. And what we ended up in the States for secondhand smoke were rules about public space. And I think ultimately what we're going to get is rules about amplification online. And I think that that'll have to be enough for now as we learn to deal with this, and as we get more and more information out of the employees of these companies who are not going to stay silent for long. Money only works until someone's fiance breaks up with them because they've turned into some kind of corporate robot, and then you get all the details. So I'll leave you with that colorful picture. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. I feel like this is an arbitrary end, but this has been a great conversation. I just want to thank all our panelists, encouraging anybody listening to check out their work online, which is really fantastic. I'll put in one plug for folks at Concordia if you're interested in these questions of media governance and AI. Bart Simon and I have our machine agencies group where we're tackling these very questions. And so hopefully this is one of the ways that we're trying to advance knowledge and the consequences of the governance of and governance by AI. And with that, I'll pass it over to Kyle for the last words. Thanks for everybody on the panel again. It was really fantastic to talk with you.
Thanks, Fenwick. Excellent job moderating the panel. I just want to thank Joan, Camille, Taylor. It was a fascinating discussion. It's going to shape a lot of our thinking, as well as all the people following in from the Canadian government and from Canadian think tanks and organizations. So thank you very much. So I'm now going to ask my colleague to remove all those panelists and the moderator from the studio, and I'll invite on the next one. And we're very fortunate to have on the next session is titled From Surveillance to Digital Authoritarianism, Breaking Down Tech and Human Rights Silos. And I think this is probably my favorite one of the AI and Human Rights Forum. Our institute's been doing a lot of work looking more at digital authoritarianism. We're going to have a panel on this at RightsCon coming up quite soon, so really happy. So I'm going to pass the floor to the moderator, who will introduce the speakers. And we're very fortunate to have with us Emily Rohala. And Emily is a Canadian citizen. She's a foreign affairs journalist for the Washington Post. Emily, thank you for joining us.
Looking forward to a great panel. It's my pleasure today to introduce our three panelists. Marietje Schaake is with the International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. Kai Strittmatter is a foreign correspondent and the author of a book on China called We Have Been Harmonized, and perhaps later he'll let us know a little bit more about the sinister undertones of the word harmonized. And Ron Diebert, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and the director of the Citizen Lab. And I believe that each of the panelists have prepared a couple minutes in terms of opening remarks. So I will turn it over to our first guest, and then we'll take it from there. So that should be Marietje.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to join this meeting. I had understood that we would do an interview style, so I have not prepared remarks, but I'm happy to share a few thoughts. I am deeply worried about the lack of credible leadership from democratic countries when it comes to the use of surveillance technologies. It has become too much of a feature of almost all of the products that we use every day, and that have only intensified because of the COVID pandemic. And so I think that the notion of surveillance capitalism has been laid out well by Shoshana Zuboff. The idea that really, the gathering of data, applying it in very different contexts than which people have shared it for, has sort of normalized the relationship between citizens and companies, but it has also made it much harder for democratic governments, think about the United States government, for example, to credibly push back against such massive data gathering in other countries where surely the context is different. There's not the rule of law, there's not rights protections, but there is essentially a real vacuum of any kind of high-level standard in the world today. And I think that is a problem. Then saying a little bit about the topic that I hope Ron will address as well, and it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with him. But that is that beyond the general surveillance practices of everyday products, social media, Internet of Things, financial services, all kinds of products that leave behind a trace of data that can be repurposed for malign goals. There are also products and services that are designed for malign goals, that are designed, marketed, and sold to repress, to hack into people's devices. Think about critical journalists, think about civil society leaders or opposition figures. And this whole market of hacking, tracking, exfiltration tools is vibrant, and it is under-regulated as so many other technologies are. We saw as early back as in the very first popular uprisings in the Middle East that European companies, the ones that I was focused on, were exporting monitoring systems, hacking and filtering systems to authoritarian regimes. And even though some regulation has been put in place right now, that has not fundamentally been curbed. So I believe that there is an enormous task before particularly democratic governments. Let's not forget that we're not going to see the regulations that we may hope for from CEOs in Silicon Valley. We really need to look to our elected democratic representatives to protect our fundamental human and democratic rights. And so I hope that we can spend some time today to look at what positive change and an agenda for positive change looks like. I'll leave it at that for my introduction. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. And you've teed up Ron perfectly. So let's hear from Ron Diepert.
Thank you so much, Emily and Marietje. I appreciate the comments, and it's great to be here on this panel. I do have a few remarks about authoritarianism because I understand that's the main focus of this panel. And the one point I want to get across is that authoritarianism shouldn't be seen as something that can be neatly compartmentalized into a bunch of bad countries over there and some good countries over there. The fact of the matter is that authoritarianism, and you could add in despotism, kleptocracy, corruption, are practices that not only transcend political boundaries, but are part of an overall world system that includes liberal democratic countries as well. So let me give you an example. Take the city of London, which, as many people know, is an important hub for real estate, litigation, PR, financial services. And for authoritarian practices to flourish, they need nodes like that. Those nodes are essential to the circulation of the type of goods and services and various protection rackets that are necessary for authoritarianism to thrive. And yet, from an academic perspective, or maybe from some of the ways that policymakers look at this question, well, the United Kingdom is a liberal democratic country. We don't have to think about it in the way that we do. We can just focus on these bad countries over there. That's not to minimize what those countries are doing, because obviously there's a big difference between a country that has a one-party state, no free and fair elections, and so on. The point I'm making is that there is an overall system, and it's a system that spans the world. And a lot of the countries in which a lot of us live who talk about these subjects are countries that are very much implicated in the problems that we're speaking about. And the same goes for the surveillance marketplace that Marietje just mentioned, that she and I have spent many years worrying about and raising awareness about the lack of regulation around this industry. Well, most of the tech that we're talking about, there are some surveillance tech platforms that are emerging, and that's worrying from authoritarian countries, but the vast majority of the products and services come from the industrialized West, from countries like Israel, for example, or countries in Europe. Canada, let me give you an example from my own country. Toronto Star recently investigated and published details about a fact that Canada approved an export license for IMSI capture technology to Bangladesh's security services. And in that reporting, it was very interesting. The Toronto Star contacted the company, it's a Canadian company, asked them about it, and they said, yes, we sold this technology to Bangladesh security services, and it was approved by the relevant authorities in the Canadian government. But the Canadian government itself wouldn't comment on the matter and has no transparency at all about how it adjudicates these types of export licenses. So I know this may come as a surprise to a lot of people from outside Canada, because our Prime Minister, generally speaking, we're known for talking loudly about human rights, but I don't think we always practice what we preach. And that was really illustrated to me most directly when we investigated the transnational repression and the hacking of the device of Omar Abdulaziz, a Canadian permanent resident, somebody who came to Canada, fled to this country from Saudi Arabia, and yet was targeted by Saudi agents using very sophisticated Israeli surveillance technology. He happened to be very close confidant with Jamal Khashoggi, and of course we all know what happened there. After our report came out, the Canadian government didn't say anything about this case. They didn't condemn it. And then afterwards, few months afterwards, my own lab was targeted by a private intelligence firm, which we presume to be Black Cube, the notorious Israel-based private intelligence firm, because of the research that we were doing on this case. And there again, nothing from the Canadian government condemning that activity. So if you stand by, if governments such as my own are silent, are inactive in the face of transnational repression and authoritarian practices, they're contributing to the problem. And I agree wholeheartedly with Marietje. It's really essential that governments that construct themselves on the basis of the rule of law and liberal democracy should be the ones that are out there most proactively doing something about regulating the marketplace that provides the tools and other products and services for these types of practices to flourish. So I'll leave it there and look forward to getting into a good discussion with you all.
Thanks so much. That's a good setup for Kai to do a brief introduction. I know your work looks very closely at surveillance and digital authoritarianism in China, but also the links between what's happening on the ground in China and its export around the world, including to liberal democracies, as Ron mentioned. Perhaps you can provide a brief introduction to your work on this and pick up that point about the sort of borderless nature of some of this technology and the way that these practices and these technologies are spreading.
Thank you very much, Emily. Actually, I'm very grateful to Ron for making some of those connections. Funny enough, when I left China, you know, I felt I had to write a book, not because every China correspondent who leaves the country has to write a book, and most of those books are really, really boring. But I really felt an urge to write this book because, first of all, I felt like people didn't really get how China was changing in a fundamental way under Xi Jinping. But funnily enough, the book actually was born the night when it was in November 2016. I left in 2018, end of 2018, but the book was born in November 2016, the night when Donald Trump was being elected president of the United States, because I was seeing so many of my friends in Europe, especially, of course, in Germany, being really puzzled about many things this guy did. And I was like, you know, the lying, the manipulation, the kidnapping of the language of the others, and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, you know, I can tell you what's going on here. I've been alternative facts, fake news. I've been living this half of my life, you know. For 20 years, I was China correspondent. I studied sinology. I lived a long time in China as a student and as a reporter, and also in Istanbul, in Turkey. I'm also grateful for that experience. But when I started really then in 2016, I actually thought, you know, I mean, democracy was in crisis. I felt this was one of the reasons why I had to write this book. But I felt it would become a book on mechanisms of dictatorship, classical mechanisms of dictatorship, you know, like the language, censorship, propaganda, the lying, collective amnesia, how you use that as an instrument. But very soon, only a couple of months later, then something very interesting happened in China. At the beginning of 2017, suddenly the State Council came out with its plan on artificial intelligence, and immediately, almost overnight, we had this explosion of activity, startups springing up, and it was like artificial intelligence, big data was everything that everyone only spoke about then. So in the end, my book turned out to be a very bit different book. It became a book on the reinvention of dictatorship. And it became really interesting because, very soon I found with AI and big data and this stuff, it not only changed the amount and the pervasiveness of surveillance by making it more high tech, but in a way it gave it a completely new quality as well. I would say, like, the two big sort of trends that we were seeing in the Chinese context were that there were big advancements in predictive policing. So predictive policing is a huge part of what this is all about. And Xinjiang is the best example. You have 1 million people sitting in labor camps, not because re-education camps, not because they have been sentenced by a court, but basically because they have been caught up in some data banks in the end, and they decide where you go. And the second thing is the internalization of control, that all these new information technologies, they help make the surveillance in China much smarter than before. And actually, I think the goal of the Communist Party is make everyone their own policeman. If the policeman is in your own head, if you are your own guardian, your own policeman, you don't need the policeman at the corner anymore. And if when the People's Daily, the party newspaper, comes out and says already in 2018, by now our Skynet, our network of surveillance camera with face recognition technology, is already capable of identifying and recognizing each and every single one of our 1.4 billion citizens in the course of a second. First of all, that sounds scary, and you sit there, you think, wow. But maybe an even more important point is to realize, the question that popped up in my head immediately was, is that even true, back in 2018? And my guess was, no, that wasn't true in 2018 yet, But the point then is, of course, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. The only thing that matters is that you believe it's true, that you have the all-seeing, all-powerful eye hovering above you. And even if it doesn't look at you at that very moment, the possibility that it might is all that you need. So I would argue, in essence, that what we're seeing in China with all these technologies is a return of totalitarianism, actually. China was a totalitarian state under Mao Zedong. It was not afterwards, 3-4 decades of reform and opening. It was always a dictatorship, but no totalitarian state anymore. The party had drawn back, had given up a lot of control. There were niches of freedom, experimentation, civil society. Now I would say we're seeing the return of totalitarianism, and it's a much smarter totalitarianism than the one in the past, because with the help of artificial intelligence, it doesn't need everyday terror anymore like it used to need in the past. Instead, it relies on this, internalization of control in everybody's head, and I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thanks.
You mentioned Xinjiang, which I think is really important, and what's happening there in terms of aggressive mass surveillance and the use of AI in policing and predictive policing to sort of form new techniques in societal control. I'm wondering if you can comment on the extent to which you see this as China driving that technologically, or is this the adaptation of technology that's in use elsewhere? If I can have you briefly comment on that, and then perhaps, Ron, you can jump in looking at the ways that some of this technology is being used elsewhere.
I think it's both, actually. Of course, we know that China, and people have said that to me. Basically, I spent the last 2 years of my time in China going to these AI startups and social credit projects and stuff like that, researching this bit. And more than once, people have told me, people working for these startups, they said, of course, we know we're still not number one in the world. The United States is technologically, it's the number one. But there's one area where we are far ahead of the United States, where we are really pioneering, and that is actually the actual, realization of all these possibilities on the ground. We're very different from the United States. We're far ahead from the United States. And why is that? Because we have the backing of our government, because we have the backing of our state. So, and Xinjiang obviously is a testing ground of a lot of these technologies, and a lot of those are pioneered there. I'm sure they will spread then in the end also to the rest of the country. But Xinjiang is really, really important in that context. But of course, also in Xinjiang, we're seeing, I mean, there's been a lot of brilliant research, investigative reporting also by American reporters, by the New York Times, and I think also the Washington Post, where they have actually proven that, you know, not only with AI technology, you know, chip technology and stuff, American technology that's being used in products there, but also, you know, those big data systems, they also collect biometric data, and for example, the DNA collecting that has been going on was done with the help of technology of American companies. So there is a lot where we are complicit in.
That's really interesting. And Ron, picking up on that, I know that the Citizen Lab has done a lot of really groundbreaking research on Chinese technology, on WeChat, on TikTok. I'm curious how you see this, how you see China's role in this from a more global perspective. What role is this technology playing? What role are some of the norms playing internationally? And are there other players that we should perhaps be talking about as well, or more?
Sure, yeah. So you're right. You know, we've spent a lot of time at the Citizen Lab digging deep into censorship and surveillance on major platforms and applications in China. And, you know, I will say it's imperfect, but effective. What's interesting is that a lot of the information controls are actually passed down to the private sector to implement. And so you see this wide variation and a lot of sloppiness, frankly. So terms that are censored, let's say on one particular messaging application, might not be censored in another. There's no homogeneity or uniformity around it. It's very distributed, which actually makes it in some ways more effective, because even though imperfect, it creates a climate of self-censorship, a sense that you're being watched no matter what you're using, which in fact is the case. The other thing I'll say is that, you know, when I started out in this area many decades ago now, everyone was saying, look, it's impossible for the one-party regime in China to withstand something like the internet. The technology is so fast-paced. There's so many distributed channels of communication, impossible to control. Well, that conventional wisdom has been proven wrong. It actually turns out that what they are doing is also a great big business opportunity. And that's because it merges and feeds into the business model of surveillance capitalism. What we're talking about here is really in synchronicity, if you will, with that business model that we're using right now as we speak to each other. But what you're seeing in China is what it looks like in the almost total absence of any political safeguards. So, you know, there is a system of laws there, but it tends to be arbitrary. There are lots of exceptions. There's lots of corruption. So, you know, whatever sloppiness you may identify, or however you may want to circumvent some of the controls, that's no substitute for proper, you know, principled democratic governance. And that's why it's so important that we get it right now, in part because it's deepening in China. But China, as we all know, has a very ambitious export regime, and a lot of the technologies that we're talking about are being included in things like the Belt and Road Initiative, like smart city initiatives. So you have government-backed loans, China-based corporations in AI, facial recognition, and so on, selling kind of off-the-shelf solutions for smart cities, which is a euphemism really for a form of you know, unbridled police control. And when you have the import of that type of system into countries that are already, let's say, flawed democracies like Brazil or other countries like that in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, it can really tilt things in that direction. So, you know, I'm definitely worried about the looming prospect of, you know, this initiative coming out of China. And the important thing here is it's very lucrative. Xinjiang, what's going on in terms of business development, is very lucrative for a lot of Chinese companies, but also non-mainland China companies. And that will make it doubly difficult to guard against, which is why I think we really need to focus on what we're doing in places like Canada, the United States, and Europe. Make sure we get our own houses in order before we point fingers about what's going on abroad, because we're going to be playing catch up very soon if we don't.
On your point about surveillance capitalism and the profitability and of all this, the complicity of private companies from Canada, from Europe, and elsewhere, I'm hoping Marietje can comment on the regulatory challenges that we see in terms of how democracies, how the democratic world can face these challenges and can sort of mount an offense or a defense, however you see it, when it comes to some of this tech and some of the norms being set in terms of AI and surveillance.
Thanks for the question. I mean, it's most unfortunate, and I could use less diplomatic words for that, how much time has been lost during which democracies, particularly the United States, had both a technological advantage and the democracies themselves had a comparative advantage to non-democratic states if you looked at the global stage. During those years, too little has happened to regulate and to ensure that there were guardrails to how technology could be used. And when I talk to Americans, they often perceive regulation as a limitation to innovation. But it's really crucial to remember that regulations, laws, the rule of law, are often the key enablers of freedoms and of people's rights. And that's how we need to think about regulatory proposals. And I think for democracies to have a chance of catching up, but also of scaling up, in light of, for example, the authoritarian sort of counter model that is gaining steam and that is also being pushed out into the rest of the world, it is vital that they work together better. And so on the one hand, we need to recognize what's already happening sort of, piece by piece. So for example, today, in case you haven't seen it yet, the official EU AI strategy has been proposed. It builds further on the values-based regulations that the EU has previously adopted. Think about the General Data Protection Regulation, but also Democracy Action Plan. The EU is known for trying to base its interventions on the fundamental rights, but also fairness in the market. So, for example, antitrust. And this AI strategy goes further in assessing which uses and applications of AI are most risky and how that risk should be mitigated. And so what I think it will do globally is set a important first mover step in shaping the regulation of AI. And the question is then, can the EU work with the United States, Canada, Japan, India, Australia, other significant players in the democratic and the broad democratic realm to collaborate towards a shared governance model, which mirrors democratic rights and principles, but applies them in new ways where it comes to AI, but also other new technologies. And I believe it's an incredible challenge, but the urgency, as Ron also underlined with what all is happening, from countries like China, but also elsewhere, really forces democratic countries to get their own houses in order, but also to hold each other to create that critical scale that is now necessary to offer, I think, a viable but also attractive alternative, attractive for companies who then have a level playing field across multiple markets and know which standards are required of them, instead of what we have now, a lot of fragmentation, quite a bit of uncertainty for companies that are trying to roll out their products and don't know whether maybe next year there will be regulatory changes and so on and so forth.
A follow-up question, you're someone who's worked both in Europe and now on issues in the United States at Stanford. I'm wondering where you see the points of difference or between the conversation on surveillance, on AI, on digital authoritarianism in Europe versus the conversation that's happening in the United States and perhaps in other liberal democracies.
That's a great question. So what strikes me in the United States is that there's always a hesitance, a reluctance to have government interference. You know, it is really left up to the market to self-correct. And I think that there's a lot of weakness in that, because the impact of technology is not only on markets, it's not only on the economy, but it's also on society, on democracy, on people's individual lives and our collective well-being. So the focus on markets is not sufficient. Another focus in the United States that I see, and that has really been amplified over the past years, is that on China and the dangers coming from China. And now a lot of people want to propose either more emphasis on national security measures when it comes to the use of technology, you know, invoking national security to make drastic interventions like banning services altogether or having new oversight over supply chains. And I think for Europeans that are, as I mentioned previously, more values-based and try to take a somewhat softer approach, there could be hopefully a sort of meeting of minds between this real political view of, you know, hard power and what stakes are faced when it comes to the systems competition that has a strong technological component, but also to have this rights-based approach. And so in my, you know, ideal world, the US approach, which looks at the world more from a national security point of view, and the European approach, which bases itself more on a values side, would sort of merge and then, you know, divide so that the best of both worlds can come together. And when I say the best of both worlds, I mean that there are serious risks when it comes to allowing all kinds of interventions on the part of the state in the name of national security, which is something that we've seen in the United States, and which has been exactly the reason why the credibility of the US as a democratic player in the field of digital rights and freedoms has been so eroded in the past. And so I hope that with a relatively new US administration, the windows to the world will open again, will open with respect and with a willingness to work together in light of shared global challenges, and that the US will be less insular than we've seen it in the past 4 years.
Ron, just picking up on those ideas, in your opening remarks, you mentioned Canada's response to things like the Khashoggi case, the harassment of activists, foreign activists on Canadian soil. I'm wondering where you think that response comes from, and what's the hesitancy on the part of officials in places like Canada to come out and act perhaps more forcefully or assertively, or really just to say publicly where the lines are in terms of these issues?
Well, I don't think it's, you know, rocket science to figure it out. I think that, you know, Canadian industry benefits from a lot of the technologies that we're talking about. And then when you add to the equation the many millions of dollars that Canadian companies make selling arms to countries like Saudi Arabia, no doubt that contributes to the reticence to speak up, which is part of the problem. I think that, you know, it's very easy to talk the talk, to say that you are in favor of women's rights, human rights, that you're a proud and noble country when it comes to these issues, but one needs to really back it up. And I think, you know, we're not a completely imperfect country. I don't want to give the wrong impression here. I don't want to, you know, hammer on the Canadian government here. But I do think it's important for those of us who live in affluent countries and have the luxury of living in a system where there are basic human rights protections. We need to push our governments to be more aggressive in terms of building the type of regulations that Marietje talked about. And you know, the world being what it is, we need a coalition of countries. One country alone, even very powerful countries, can't solve a lot of the problems that we see coming on the horizon. And so it's important that the countries get together. The spyware market would be a good example of that. My colleagues and I have made very detailed recommendations on the type of measures that governments could put in place, whether it's through more stringent export controls or sanctions against particular offenders that could help mitigate some of the harms that we've been identifying. But in order to do that, you know, in a place like Canada, citizens have to elect officials who care about those issues. That's the bottom line. I mean, here I'm in a city, in a province right now that's an absolute mess with the pandemic, in part because of the government that's in power that is completely inept. Well, you know, they didn't get there through a coup, right? We elected them. So citizens need to be informed. They need to understand the issues at stake, why it matters to them ultimately down the road, and then elect officials who will carry that agenda forward.
Kai, I'd like to get you in on some of these regulatory and also norm setting questions as well. As I was preparing for this panel, I was reflecting a little bit on how things have changed. I was thinking back to being in China in, I think it was either 2015 or 2016 at the Wuzhen Internet Conference, where we heard from Xi Jinping via a video stream warning the audience assembled there, including some executives from Western tech companies, about the internet is essentially a dangerous place, a place that needs to be controlled and weighed and ruled by an assertive sovereign state. And as far back as 2015, 2016, I think that view was very much out of line with discourse elsewhere. And in recent years, we've seen much more of a consensus, it's far from a consensus, but much more of a consensus view that, you know, the internet should be regulated, that that there needs to be strong government action, which was not part of the conversation not so many years ago. So tell me how some of these regulatory questions look from where you're sitting and based on your research for your book.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I don't know whether you saw the tweet by the People's Daily. Was that in 2018 or something? When they tweeted out to Donald Trump, there was a yes, the real Donald Trump, he's right. Fake news is the problem. You know, suddenly they found themselves on the same side with some of the actors in the Western world, and maybe even in Europe, some people are having second thoughts now when we're talking about regulating the internet. Yes or no? I was in Wuzhen actually in 2017. So maybe 1 or 2 years after you, and there was still the same sort of warning of the dangerous nature of the internet, why every country needs to regulate it by themselves. But back then already there was a trend visible that you actually had, you know, someone, I think Ron spoke about the commercial side of all this, the commercial exports of AI technology, actually directly from Xinjiang, you know, the companies that go there, Huawei and the others, there's an industrial park near Urumqi that was set up not only for them to bring their technology to the public security organs in Xinjiang, but specifically also to set up a base to export all these technologies to Central Asian countries, Belt and Road countries. But the important thing is that even back then, we could already see that not only did they export their technologies and made money with that, but they exported for free, I guess, the legal framework also and their rulemaking. They had actually seminars in Beijing where they would invite people, Russians, for example. Actually, they had seminars in Moscow where they sent people from Beijing a couple of times to Moscow to actually lecture the Russians on some of those things. And I think it was it Freedom House that first published a report when they were speaking about the export of those things. And actually already in 2018, I think they were counting at least half a dozen countries that had actually copied part of China's legislation, actually. And so there's a thing where we really need to be careful also I'm speaking from a European viewpoint, and I agree with what's been said that we need to be united. We need to be united as Europeans. We need to be in a common camp with the United States on this. But we need, because I think, you know, countries like Germany or Canada or France, we're we're not the first targets and the weakest links as far as those developments are concerned. But what do we have to offer to those countries that are actually the main partners of China in its new Silk Road, in its Belt and Road Initiative? What actually did we do for them in the past decades? And those are the countries where Huawei actually makes its biggest business with its smart cities that have been mentioned. But if you're a city like Lagos in Nigeria or Karachi in Pakistan, and Huawei comes to you and says, "Look, we have our smart city concept here. We have different models. You can take." You can take package number 1, which includes wastewater management and traffic management and this and that. But we really would advise you to also add on the top our security layer, our face recognition cameras. And we will guarantee you that basically overnight, the security situation in your city will improve and your women can walk more safely on the streets and the handbags won't be stolen from the buses and stuff like this. And it turns out it actually works, It doesn't go, of course, it doesn't cure the root of the problem, social inequality, crime, all this. But, where the cameras are, you probably will have suddenly much fewer criminals. But this is a question that we have to bring our own house in order, but we also really have to think hard about how we cooperate in the future, again, with all those developing countries in Asia, in Central Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, which are at the moment the biggest customers of Chinese surveillance technology.
It strikes me that all three of you have raised the surveillance capitalism idea and stressed that this is on a very big level about profit making. I'm wondering what lessons you draw from that in terms of consumer behavior and what consumers should be thinking about, could be thinking about, and also whether or not in your policy work, in your reading and thinking and speaking on regulation, you see much concern from consumers, whether people are sort of connecting their personal technology habits or the products they use to these issues. Does anyone want to jump in on that one?
Sure, I could say a few words to start with. Or Ron, did you want to go?
No, please go ahead, Marietje.
Okay. I mean, to some extent, I think we should limit our expectations in terms of what an individual vis-a-vis armies of lawyers, designers, and engineers on the other end of the screen can really achieve. I mean, I don't want to underestimate the ability to educate people and people's capacities to make wise choices, but there is an asymmetry in power that must be recognized, and that is why regulations are important. And I would say 2 elements here would be helpful to add. One is that of access to information, because it is nearly impossible to make an informed decision as a consumer when asked to click, okay or yes or agree to the terms of service or the terms of use that are presented. And too often we see that companies don't adhere to their own promises, or they change the terms of use, or data gets leaked or breached, and promised protections or narrowly defined uses are simply not honored. So that's where regulations should really impose requirements, both in terms of what is expected from companies and other services, as well as access to information, so that there can be independent oversight, so that there can be better informed policymaking, regulations, journalism, civil society scrutiny, and so on. The other part that I think we should not underestimate is the security risk that comes from an ever-growing possible or potential attack surface with every device that gets connected, with every smart city, smart appliance, biotech application that gets rolled out. We have recently seen in the SolarWinds hack and in the Exchange server hack incredible amounts of data compromised. Data that is supposed to be secured at the highest level, that were apparently accessible for attacks that have been attributed for to Russia for espionage, and to China for basically disproportionate intrusion and an attack. So the reality of this whole model of ever greater connectivity, more data collected, more systems put online, also presents real risks for national security. And I think that has been, a rude awakening, particularly in the United States, that has so celebrated, its shiny successes from Silicon Valley, big tech, the envy of the world for a long time. And suddenly it turns out that these big successes are actually big vulnerabilities. And there needs to be more democratic regulations, oversight, learning in the public interest to actually resolve those very problems that also stem from the notions of surveillance capitalism as a sort of, foundational part of our technology systems these days.
Ron, you want to jump in there?
Well, Marietje took the words right out of my mouth. We're singing from the same songbook on both of those points. Really great point she made there, and I agree wholeheartedly. I'll just say, with respect to the security issue, absolutely. I mean, you're increasing the attack surface, and when you factor in the desire among many authorities to build into our systems insecurities of various sorts as backdoors for surveillance, essentially, creating the digital equivalent of Swiss cheese when it comes to all of the technologies that surround us. I just saw this week there was a not uncommon news item about a smart fryer had a vulnerability which would allow a remote attacker to exploit it and turn up the heat. So it's like a kitchen Stuxnet, right? And that's exactly what Marietje is talking about. We have to worry about. And when it comes to consumers, absolutely, there's a structural asymmetry here. And that's why, personal responsibility can only go so far, especially for those who are the most marginalized members of our society, people who are under pressure, that face all sorts of structural incentives to, participate in the personal data surveillance economy. It's very difficult as an individual to remove yourself from this overwhelming force, which is precisely why we need to counter that in order to protect consumers with principled democratic governance. And we absolutely need, it's a no-brainer to me that we need some mechanism of algorithmic accountability. We need some public sector, doesn't have to even be within the government, it's some mechanism whereby companies are held to account for what's going on inside their internal workings. And the analogy I'd use here, it's kind of like, imagine if we didn't allow food inspectors into a food processing plant. It would be unthinkable in this day and age. And yet we don't have a similar mechanism for agencies who work in the public interest to inspect the inner workings, the algorithms of the big tech platforms that structure so much of our daily lives. This doesn't make sense to me. And that's where I think we need to start.
It's so interesting that you brought up algorithms as well. I was thinking that we could perhaps close, we have about 10 more minutes, talking about TikTok. I think it's a really interesting example for multiple reasons. It bridges China and the rest of the world, and it also raises questions about regulation, national security, some fear mongering. We talked about the national security threat element of regulation. I think in the case of the very swift, opaque U.S. crackdown on tech under Trump, we saw some of the pitfalls of that approach. But I'm interested in the app also from the perspective of this idea of shaping reality. When I use the app, which is incredibly addictive and very, very fun, I'm reminded often of another Xi Jinping favorite, which is creating positive energy on the internet. This idea that the internet regulation is also about uncovering the algorithms and the ideas that are shaping our reality, whether that's feeding us exclusively lighthearted content or shaping reality in different ways. Any of you want to jump in on TikTok specifically or on algorithmic censorship?
I can take a first stab at it because it's timely. one of our Citizen Lab researchers, Pei-Lian Lin, just did the most comprehensive technical breakdown of TikTok to date. And what we found, I guess there's good news and bad news. The good news is there was nothing inside that we could discover that seemed to be some kind of, subterfuge or secret mechanism to undertake surveillance of users by the state in China. The bad news is it's just about as voracious in terms of data gathering as any other social media application, such as Facebook, which is not surprising, really. And then there's a latent concern with any technology that's headquartered in mainland China, is that because of the lack of safeguards to prevent the abuse of power and China's cybersecurity laws, there's always the prospect that the government could require authorities to turn over user data. In terms of positive feeling and making us feeling well, this is the logic of surveillance capitalism, right? Every application has at least two functions. One is the apparent one. In the case of TikTok, it's to make a fun video, but then the higher level function is to extract as much data from us, the users, as possible. And in order to do that, they make their products as compelling. And that includes content. We're attracted to sensational content. It includes the design of the devices and applications, little, red icons bumping up and down on your desktop make you anxious. They make you want to check that. Those are deliberate design functions that are meant to entice us. And they're part of the reason why it's so difficult to extract oneself from the universe of all of this technology.
Kai or Marietje, do either of you want to jump in on that?
Unfortunately, I don't use TikTok, and neither do my two little children. But I think, on positive energy, of course, that's the whole thing, right? It's about the narrative that the party wants to control. And this term has been very old on the Chinese internet, and Xi Jinping has revived it. Everyone has to engage in activities and speech that radiates positive energy. And I think, these algorithms, they've existed for a while now. The People's Daily called it red algorithms. Algorithms that work in the favor of the Communist Party. And I don't think they only meant, politically correct algorithms. I think they also meant that. And the mother company of TikTok, they're publishing actually the most popular news aggregator app in China, which is Toutiao, meaning like headline news or something. And you saw a very clear example of that going on when actually Xi Jinping announced this decision, or basically the party announced the decision, or was it the People's Congress, I think, that they were actually abolishing the term limits for Xi Jinping, that suddenly Xi Jinping could become president for life, which was a huge thing for the urban classes, especially, the educated netizens in China. It caused a huge uproar for some time before the census got in there. But if you looked at Toutiao, the day when that happened, the top 5 topics on that, I can't remember all of them, but number one was the number one topic on Toutiao that day was which kind of instant noodles are the best to eat on a high-speed railway train. And number 2 was something about how do you make your girlfriend happy. So it's long going on in China, yeah.
Marietje, I think regulating algorithms is probably a topic big enough for another panel, but if you have 1 minute worth of thoughts on this or other topics to close this out, I welcome your thoughts.
Well, thanks. Let me try to link it to the TikTok discussion, because it was so fascinating when President Trump decided to ban the app, or threatened to ban the app altogether. And I was thinking back to the time when European teens were massively and suddenly downloading this foreign social media app and sharing all their data with Facebook or YouTube or other apps. And the whole idea of banning these services. Never ever was proposed in Europe. And so it's interesting to see what happens in the absence of regulations that spell out what an enabling environment for using these products and services with respect for people's rights and also children's safety in this case looks like. And so I think Ron mentioned it earlier in the panel that, the catching up of others, notably China, but also other, countries that are now producing impactful technologies really requires us to rethink whether this lack of regulations and oversight was really such a good idea, and to put them in place before it's too late, so that indeed people can be entertained. Although sometimes I worry that we are entertaining ourselves to death on the internet. There's also other things in entertainment that are important, but in any case, to make sure that there are conditions within which these services can be used with preservation of the well-being of users, and not just to have this avalanche of realities, streaming in from other countries with all the negative consequences only discovered when it's already too late.
I think that's a perfect note to end on today. And I will, first of all, thank all the panelists and throw it over to Kyle.
Thank you. Just in closing, I want to thank Mariette, Kai, Ron, and Emily. It was a fascinating discussion. So much to think about. I know all our followers were really following this, and we'll continue the discussion. I just want to remind everyone watching that this is the end of day 2 of the AI and Human Rights Forum, but we're continuing tomorrow. So please join us. We're going to be talking about AI and UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll also be talking about the ethics of AI and how to ensure democratic governance. So on behalf of my colleagues, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.